to the first chapter. Here we'll be looking at a graphic I made about a year ago, which I believe contains a pretty accurate look at where we think astrology, modern Western astrology, came from. And the first thing we can do is take a look at a map, and we can look at Mesopotamia. So this is the Mediterranean, and Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We see Sumer and Babylon. These were city-states that had court astrologers, and we have artifacts from Babylon of 16 clay tablets, which were astrological omens. And the rulers of these city-states most likely had court astrologers that were informing them, making predictions based on the movements of the heavenly bodies. So the star-like radiant things like Venus and Mars, these planets. And this is really the dawn of the first ephemeris, the ephemerae. So a chart that would predict the cycles of these heavenly bodies. We could now see that there were repeating cycles, and we were looking for correlation and causation between the movement of these heavenly bodies and what was going on down here on Earth. And we should also note that between these two rivers, they were prone to flooding, and the gods were known to be quite vindictive. So the idea that we would look up and look for premonitions, and that the rulers of these city-states would want to know what may be happening so that they could rule more effectively, that these things were most likely in motion at this time. And the Greeks, this is 300 BC and earlier, the Greeks considered the Mesopotamians and the Chaldeans, who moved in, we think, from the Horn of Africa, as the ancients and the potential bearers of this ancient craft. So even they looked back to a more ancient people for this wisdom. They also, the early astrologers of the Hellenistic period, so 300 to 36 BC, also look back to 6 key figures that are mentioned, who are also credited with the originators of this craft. And I should note that it's through Chris Brennan's book of Fate and Fortune and Hellenistic Astrology that a lot of this research comes from. So Chris wrote a great book, and he's actually the host of the Astrology podcast on YouTube, which may be worth checking out. He seems to be a great interviewer. But these are the 6 characters that are mentioned, and that is Hermes and Thoth. And we should remember that Alexander the Great actually conquered, but he conquered within a system of syncretism. So he allowed the people and the intelligences of these people and their relationship to time to coexist together. And the city of Alexandria was built, and the library of Alexandria, including the first museum, the Places of the Muses, were built. So this is why we think of the Library of Alexandria as really a place where scholarly work was supported. And there were anywhere from, they say, 40 to 40,000 scrolls that were being researched. So there was a real synthesis of intelligence going on in this period, around 200 BC. So, given that, we have syncretism going on between a figure like a god like Hermes, the messenger of the gods that later became Mercury in Rome, and Thoth of Egypt, who was worshipped and celebrated in Thebes. Thebes, also in Egypt, a city, also claims that it was the originator of astrology. Other characters and their partner character in Egypt, the Greek character Asclepius and Imhotep of Egypt. And then Nichepso and Petasiris are 2 characters from around 678, it says, 672 BCE for Nichepso, Petasiris around the same time. These 2 characters are also credited with being some of the original founders of astrology. So what we can really gather from this timeline is that there was a great convergence of knowledge in the Hellenistic period. And the Hellenistic astrology that originates from this time also continued to be practiced until about 750 CE, so almost 1,000 years, or we can call it 800 to 1,000 years there was an astrological practice called Hellenistic astrology that was active. And then, as we'll see, so the Hellenistic astrology expands beyond the period of what we call the Hellenistic period. Then we can look at some lulls in astrology that include, of course, the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. There was a real emphasis on placing our faith in only things that could really be tested and trusted. So the scientific method made skeptics, I think, out of people who couldn't make sense of this left-right brain metaphysical bridge to time. And this, I think, makes a lot of sense. But there were characters like Johannes Kepler, shown here in this little graphic, who were trying to use logic and reason and to push away the gods, the polytheistic gods that sat behind everything in, it seemed, the Greek faiths, and to look towards harmonics and science. And he was a polymath, so as a mathematician he was looking for ways to explain how this phenomena could be real. And then, of course, the scientific revolution ends with Sir Isaac Newton. And then we have the Age of Enlightenment, and then we have the Industrial Revolution, where we really started to mechanize our world. Specialization of labor and the making of things through an industrial process. And it's my hypothesis that from there, as we enter a moment of spiritualism and the advent, as we look down here to this last part of the graphic of the Theosophists and the founding of Theosophy with Helena Blavatsky and Henry Alcott, that in response to watching the mechanism of our world, these industries growing, that we looked back to the Neoplatonists and we look back further in time for some sense of what was real in a rational way, to find spirit through rational thought, and to look through the wisdom schools of old, as like a Manly P. Hall would talk about, as really a guiding force. And something that we really need to do is look to these ancient truths and these potentially universal truths to give us some compass, because we were starting to see what we could do with our power as people. So as we look at this, I believe this is really the dawn of modern Western astrology. And it was because people like Alan and Bessie Leo were members of the Theosophical Society operating out of England and writing some of the first fundamental books on modern astrology, including Alan's book, The Art of Synthesis, which is How to Judge a Nativity. So this was a very early book from around 1912, 1914. And this was someone influenced by the Theosophists in the realm of spirit and matter and time as a binding force, called Fohat, this animating quality. And they were writing some of the first fundamental books that were thought of as modern astrology. In the United States, we had people like Manly P. Hall, who was also reaching back in time and writing a very popular book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He recognizes astrology in this book as well. And so the masses are reading about this. And then you have a character like Grant Louis, who starts an astrology magazine and writes a book in 1935 called Heaven Knows What. This is a sun-moon combination sign in 36 parts. And it deals with, the combination of astrological moon and sun energy in combination, and I think it's a really neat book. I bought it, and I bought it because Gary Goldschneider, this was his hook. I think a lot of us in astrology are handed a book, and we can't really make sense of how this narrative is working so synergistically between inner voice and this outer projection of the astrological language. So this was Gary's hook. Gary's also he wrote The Secret Language of Birthdays back in 94 and The Secret Language of Relationships, which are hugely popular books. And he was studying human psychology at Harvard, and he was interested in Abraham Maslow and this hierarchy of needs. And so it's my hypothesis that from Grant Louis on, for this 70-year period, we have publications in 1967 by Carl Jung called Symbols and Transformation. And then the year after, we have a hugely popular book by Linda Goodman, Sun Sign Astrology, who even to this day on YouTube, some of the most popular videos on YouTube, there are great astrologers who I think really mean well, who are reading directly from Linda Goodman's work from 1968. So if you take a look at this chart, I believe this points out some of the key moments in time that have really delivered the language of modern astrology. And a lot of it has to do with personality psychology and the inner mechanical workings in language that psychologists were coming up to explain how we meet our human needs and how the personality presents itself. And Carl Jung is a big part of that, with his idea of the collective unconscious expressing itself, and how these mythical archetypes are seen in seemingly disparate people around the world. So this is my take on where modern astrology has come from and how it's evolved into such a deeply personal language that takes advantage of the most ancient language that comes to us from the Hellenistic period. So, thank you so much. And now we'll really start to look at what is the philosophy that ties the human body to the fabric of time. And we'll look at the 4 cardinal points, starting with looking to the east of sunrise and the spring equinox. Okay, I'll see you there.